Hey everyone, before we get into the regularly scheduled episode, I wanted to go ahead and make an announcement. I am part of a new podcast called Sunset City. It's a podcast where we are talking about all things Sonic the Hedgehog, past, present, and potentially future, and I am part of this podcast with Channel Pup, Wayne is Boss, and of course, Game Apologist. So if you like video game talk, if you like podcasts and long-form content, then maybe go ahead and check us all out at Sunset City, where we will be doing our best to provide you weekly-ish podcasts, depending on everyone's availability. But with all that said, we'll go ahead and get into the regularly scheduled episode, but please check out the YouTube channel for the podcast, and also check out the links at that channel where you can get access to the RSS feed on a variety of different podcasting platforms so that you can see the episodes in audio-only form if you happen to be busy and don't have the ability to click on YouTube videos. Anyway, all that said, regular episode. Let's go. Super fun. Let's talk about voting. It's great about living in a democracy. We get a chance to vote. Now, how effective and weighted those votes are is a conversation for another day. Let's just talk about the mere idea that if you live in a society where there are laws imposed upon you, then everybody should have a say in what those laws are. Okay, can we agree on that? Okay, cool. The National Review cannot. Kevin D. Williamson apparently thinks that fewer people should be allowed to vote. So, let's go ahead and see why this man hates democracy. Much of the discussion about proposed changes to voting laws, backed by many Republicans and generally opposed by Democrats, begs the question and simply asserts that having more people vote is a good thing. Okay, now, I'm not going to just deconstruct that sentence because there's more here that we need to look at. Why should we believe that? Why shouldn't we believe the opposite, that the Republic would be better served by having fewer, but better voters? Many Americans, being devout egalitarians, recoil from the very notion of better voters as a matter of rhetoric, even as they accept qualifications as a matter of fact. So, here's the thing, even if I can accept that I would rather there be more Democrats, for instance, voting in the United States than Republicans, merely because the end results of that tend to be better for minority rights, tend to be better for egalitarianism, tend to be better for weeding out religious rhetoric from our schools. Even if I accept that fact, I still have to accept that by creating arbitrary distinctions that can block people from voting, those arbitrary distinctions can be levied against me as well, or anyone else. And when I do that, when I start engaging in that little game, and we start building the arbitrary distinctions where people can't vote, we get things like voting via IQ. Which means that people who are disadvantaged, say, don't have the ability to vote for their own interests. They just have to accept that they're living in a society. They're also living in a society with taxation without proper representation, because they can't elect their representation. There's no longer proper representation. You'd have to have these people not even paying taxes anymore, which, again, if you're like a hardcore libertarian, maybe you accept that that's a good thing. I don't. Taxes are how we pay for infrastructure. But my hay fever shit aside, categorically disenfranchising felons has always been, in my view, the intelligent default position. Wait, really? Let's talk about what a felon is, okay? Let's talk about a felon for just a second. So, a felon is any person who's been convicted of a felony. Now, what is a felony? A felony is any crime, typically one involving violence, regarded as more serious than a misdemeanor and usually punishable by imprisonment for more than 1 year, or by death. Now, these are broad categories, but things like selling drugs are a felony. So if somebody, say, needs to sell drugs to survive, and in so doing, they create selling, possession, what have you, whatever, semantics aside, and in so doing, they become a felon, now there's an arbitrary distinction where somebody who did something for survival is no longer allowed to vote for their best interests, even though the economic system put them in a scenario where they had to engage in that behavior in order to survive for themselves or for their family. So, I think felons should be allowed to vote, personally. And if you think that they are such a substantial representation of the population to where their vote will suddenly shift things into anarchy and chaos, then maybe we should take a look at our prison systems and see why we consider so many people felons, so we can drop that number down so your wee little feelings can stop being hurt. But, for now, we will continue with the article. Reenfranchisement happens on a case-by-case basis. It is likely that under such a practice, some people who ought to be considered rehabilitated would unjustly be excluded, but all eligibility requirements risk excluding somebody who might make a good voter, or a better voter than someone who is eligible. Yeah, this is one of the reasons why you shouldn't have these enfranchisement parameters in the first place. There are plenty of very and smart, responsible 16-year-olds who would make better voters than their dim and irresponsible older siblings or their parents. That doesn't mean we should have 16-year-old voters. I'd be more inclined to raise the voting age to 30. It means only that categorical decision-making by its nature does not account for certain individual differences. So this means that somebody would effectively be an adult for several years, over a decade, and they would not be allowed to change anything. Now, what is created when you have this scenario? What do you effectively do? Well, people tend to be more conservative as they get older. Now, I'm not saying that they lean more left or right as they get older. I'm saying that they tend to want to conserve the world in which they grew up. They don't want to radically change the world because they've adjusted to it by that point. This argument is effectively saying that you want people who've adjusted to be comfortable in an unjust world to continue voting for the proliferation of the unjust mechanisms that led to the world they live in. I don't think that's a healthy thing to do. Having young voters is perfectly fine. I think that the age of 18 is perfectly fine to vote. Hell, if you need desperately to say when cognition is fully developed or what other dumb shit you want to argue, then maybe you can make an argument for 25, but I'd never even argue that. I'd say that as soon as somebody is an adult and they are participating in society, they are paying taxes, they are working jobs, what have you, doesn't matter. As soon as this person is an adult and they are integrating into society at large, or at least have the potential to, they should be allowed to vote. If they're going to participate in the world, they should have the ability to change it. Making an argument for people having to wait until they're older to vote only creates more people comfortable with the status quo. That's not what we need. We don't need people comfortable with the status quo. The mere fact that you have adjusted to it does not suddenly mean that the status quo is good. This is the argument from tradition. It is a fallacy, and it's not one that has been expressly engaged in throughout this article, but it is the only angle I can conceivably think, while trying to steelman this person's position, that could lead to them coming to this conclusion. They think older voters are more experienced and better, but there's also the implication that they're going to be more likely to vote not for systemic change, but for returns to normalcy, whatever they view normalcy to be. By their definition of adult, it's giving up on hopes and dreams. A lot of people have that view that being a proper adult is giving up on your hopes and dreams, and I hate that view. I think that that's an entirely destructive mindset, and it leads to people hurting themselves. People should be allowed to pursue their dreams and the things they want. They shouldn't engage in this, I'm not going to say nihilistic mindset because that's not accurate, but this mindset that they're not allowed to go forward in life without getting rid of, quote, unrealistic expectations of the world around them. So, he then goes, similarly, asking for government-issued photo ID at the polls seemed to me to be obviously the right thing to do, even if it would result in some otherwise eligible voters not voting. I'm not convinced that having more voters is a good thing in any case, but even if I were, that would not be the only good, but only one good competing with other goods, one of which is seeing to it that the eligibility rules on the books are enforced so that elections may be honestly and credibly regulated. Now, wait a minute. Honestly and credibly regulated, that's a loaded term here. Let's go ahead and do a thing. Let's go ahead and do a very, very quick thing. This is called National Review, right? Let's do a very quick check. I haven't done that before here. So, luckily, we have a mostly factual reporting case, but this is an op-ed, so that doesn't matter so much for the conversation at hand. We do have a right bias, though, which, I mean, anybody could have guessed at this point. These media sources are strongly biased towards conservative causes through story selection and political affiliation. They utilize strong loaded words, which of course we have right here. Elections may be honestly incredibly regulated. Does he believe that elections are honestly incredibly regulated right now? Is there some bar that's not being met at the current moment? You be the judge. We had a whole insurrection over this. We could verify eligibility at the polls rigorously and easily, if we wanted to, just as we have the ability to verify who's eligible to enter the country, or to drive a car. Okay, yeah, the eligibility for voting in a country should be, are you a citizen of that country? Cool, you're eligible to vote. Arguing otherwise, trying to segment it otherwise, would be to put arbitrary limitations on who can and can't vote, and you can argue that this is one good in a sea of other possible goods. But those other possible goods mean that people basically have to be existing in their country without the ability to influence what happens in it. They only get to be cogs in a machine. They don't get to actually make the world better for them, for their children, insofar as voting can work towards that. Of course, that would put some burdens on voters. So what? We expect people, including poor and struggling people, to pay their taxes. Why shouldn't we expect them to keep their driver's license up to date? If voting really is the second duty that we're always being told it is, shouldn't we treat it at least as seriously as filing a 1040 easy? Yes, we should. Which is why voting should be as easy, seamless, and painless as possible for all voters. Trying to treat voting as a burden for voters is in itself an attempt to lessen the amount of people who are voting. There are people, and I've seen these takes before, and I disagree with them wholeheartedly, that think that making voting harder will make people appreciate voting more, and so we will get better voters out of it or some shit. No. Voter enfranchisement is important. More people need to be allowed to vote on policy changes. More people need to be able to influence the world around them and the country in which they live. Period. Being forced to only be a cooperator, a cog in the machine, that's not healthy for anybody, in any way, shape, or form. There would be more voters if we made it easier to vote, and there would be more doctors if we didn't require a license to practice medicine. These are not the same thing. A doctor engages in life-or-death situations, and if they are not properly trained, they can get people killed in the immediate. Even the most well-informed voter can vote incorrectly, can vote in such a way that is against their interests. We see this from the Republican Party all the time. Also, thank you very much, Fox Skulkwood, for the follow. But the mere fact that somebody could vote against their interests or vote against the interests of multiple people at hand does not mean that we should bar them from voting. Whereas a doctor who is incapable will cause immediate harm in the here and now. It is less likely, the more informed a doctor is, that they will harm someone. With voting, I would like to be optimistic and say that the more informed a voter is, the more likely they are to vote in a way that doesn't harm people. But I don't think that's the case. I think that in either case, all a well-informed voter is going to be is somebody who can more easily understand why they're voting for what they're voting for. It doesn't necessarily mean they're going to vote for, quote, the right thing. These scenarios are not directly juxtaposable. If we're going to have a voting system at all, we need to make sure that everybody is allowed to vote. And I'm not trying to argue that just as a truism. I'm trying to point out that any arbitrary distinction that you put in for voters can be used to disenfranchise you as well. And I don't think that's fair. I don't think that's healthy. I don't think that's a good thing. The fact that we believe unqualified doctors to be a public menace but act as though unqualified voters were just stars in the splendid constellation of democracy indicates how little real esteem we actually have for the vote, in spite of our public pieties. So, again, this does not work because these are categorically different things. An unqualified doctor is somebody who categorically doesn't have the licensure to be a doctor. An unqualified voter is a non-citizen. Or, in certain cases, a non-citizen or a felon. These are not the same thing categorically. And even the most well-informed voter will vote things that will ultimately cause harm. Think about America right now. Think about the choice between Biden and Trump. Has Biden done a lot of good in America at the moment? Yes, especially where trans issues are concerned. Has he done a lot of bad? Yes, we still have cages at the border. We still have funding being put towards the border wall, as far as I know. We still have issues with foreign policy, and none of these issues are being solved right now by President Biden. But we still ended up in this scenario, this nightmare scenario, where we had to vote for him, because that was the only option available that was functional. Any other option just led to Trump. So, what qualifies as a good voter? How would you choose a good voter? How would you knock them out? In my opinion, I would just take the conservatives out of the conversation. But I'm not going to do that, because their vote still matters. There are trade-offs in voting, as there are in all things. Democrats prefer to minimize attention paid to voting fraud and eligibility enforcement. Yeah, remember when I mentioned before the thing about loaded language? This seems like a way for them to... Let's tell it like it is. What does somebody like this actually want? They want Republicans to win. That's what they want. They want Republicans and conservatives to win. Historically, when fewer people vote, Republicans win more often. Because there are more people with blue values in densely populated areas in the United States. However, many of them don't end up voting. I am wholly optimistic in that there are more progressives in the United States than there are regressive conservatives. However, regressive conservatives tend to get up off of their ass and vote more in the US. Either because they don't believe in the same type of nihilistic, Ouroboros self-destructive mentality that the left does, or any number of reasons. This is not the video to discuss those. And a point was just made in the chat by Sir Isaac. All voters are technically uninformed, since politicians obfuscate the actual intent behind trivial things like wedge issues. Yeah, and there's issues like pork fat bills that get thrown out all the time as well. And nobody, even as well-informed as a voter as they are going in, is going to have time to read through a, say, 1,000-page pork fat bill. Nobody has that kind of time. Even the politicians whose job it is to do that don't have that kind of time. Even a little bit of fraud or improper voting is something that should be discouraged and, if possible, prevented. It is, spare me your sob stories, something that should be prosecuted in most cases. Okay, so what do we call voter fraud here? Because if we're talking about Georgia, voter fraud is just not matching your signature. We should prosecute people for not writing their signature right the second time? Shut the fuck up. This isn't a sob story issue. This is you just not understanding how people function. I'm also going to change the song because I feel like this one does not work for this. Just no. You know what? This is fine. This one's fine. It is a fact that many of the things that would be useful in discouraging and presenting voter fraud would also tend to make voting somewhat more difficult for at least some part of the population. Notice how vague this person's being. Some part of the population, somewhat more difficult. He's not getting into specifics about who would be disenfranchised. Here, it's usually minority groups. And historically, minority groups tend to vote Democrat. So, I wonder if that's who he's trying to stop from voting. Who knows? Republicans generally think the trade-off is worth it. Democrats generally don't. That's because when you disenfranchise voters, generally Republicans are the ones that get the vote. Is there motivated reasoning at work there? Of course! But the mere presence of political self-interest does not tell us whether policy is good or bad. How much more of this article is there? Cool. One argument for encouraging bigger turnout is that more eligible voters go to the polls, then the outcome will more closely reflect the average American voter's wants. That sounds like a wonderful thing if you haven't met the average American voter. Okay, so this is the very fucking Ayn Randian objectivist view on people that There are the standard populist people, and then there are the special people whose opinions matter more. And the people who are in the general populace shouldn't be allowed to vote, shouldn't be allowed to do much, or at least should be segregated in some way, because their opinions lead to greater harm, whereas the special people, the enlightened ones, the whatever arbitrary measure you want to throw in your fountainhead-sucking brain, you still come to the same conclusion that there are a handful of people who should be making the decisions. How big you make that handful is up to you. I reject that idea wholeheartedly. The idea that there are some Americans that are just more special than other ones that should have more weight to their votes or allowed to vote more, or anything like that. Just stop. I know where this idea comes from, and it can suck a giant chode. Voters, individually and in majorities, are as apt to be wrong about things as they are to be right about them. They often vote from low motives such as bigotry and spite, and very often are contentedly ignorant. So, he's not wrong in saying that, but that seems like a sentence that's deliberately meant to make someone who would generally vote Democrat nod their head and go, yeah, you're kind of right. Republicans would generally vote from a place of bigotry and spite, except he's doing this because he knows that the numbers generally will allow you to get more Republicans in. Also, thank you very much, Channel Pup, for the follow. Why has it taken you so long, you absolute bastard? That is one of the reasons why the original constitutional architecture of this country gave voters a narrowly limited say in most things and took some things, like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, etc., off the voters' tables entirely. Okay, it's because we viewed those things as axiomatic, not because we viewed some people as better voters than others. We accepted freedom of speech and freedom of religion as axioms with which to found the country. Let's talk about what axioms are for a fucking second, okay? An axiom is essentially a presupposition. This is a foundational belief, something with which you build other beliefs on top of. You have to have some level of axiomatic thought to function as an individual. There are things that you take as what are called brute facts, things that are base level, foundational, that don't need to be justified within themselves because they are, of their nature, foundational. An axiom is what you build your arguments from. These things, you're going to have a certain number of them to begin with. What axioms you use, up for debate. Not all axioms are good. I know I said doesn't need to be justified. That was not exactly the best way to define axioms. My apologies. You know what, Google? Just fucking... Here we go. Just Google, what's an axiom? A statement or proposition which is regarded as being established or self-evidently true. Yay! Thank you. Because I was tripping over myself doing it off the top of my head. Neat! It is easy to think of critical moments in American history when given the majority, its way would have produced horrifying results. If we'd had a fair and open national plebiscite about slavery on December in 1865, slavery would have won in a landslide. If we held another one on abolishing the death penalty today, the death penalty would be sustained. Again, this is dishonesty utilizing truth. So, the goal of an article like this, the goal from a conservative bent, is to get more conservatives in office. Generally speaking, more conservatives get into office the fewer people who vote. Generally speaking, in America, the fewer voters, the more often things come out red, and not in the fun way. By using these appeals to progressive language, this is meant to get a Democrat on board, somebody who's maybe generally more on the left on board, with these ideas about arbitrary divides and where we should allow voting. How many people should be allowed to vote, which people should be allowed to vote, etc. When you do that, you get somebody who will, ironically, vote against their best interests because you have obfuscated the issue. You've pointed out, hey, if the majority won, we would have still had slavery. You know what? Whether or not you're correct in that assertion, by putting it out that way, you are trying to appeal to the base emotional argument that a left-leaning person is going to make. They're going to say slavery bad. They're going to say that death penalty bad. And you're going to use those as bludgeons to try to force them to agree with your position. Force is maybe not the best word. But it's very, very manipulative language. And it's meant not to manipulate a Republican. A Republican already probably believes half this shit. Not all of them. Not everybody can be painted with a broad brush. But again, generally, these are things that somebody on the right already believes. In some way, shape, or form. This is meant not to convince them. This is meant to convince somebody who's probably more frequently in my audience. If the questions of the quality of polity outcomes, then both major camps have reasons to dread genuine majority rule. But see, we already have a mechanism to solve this problem. We don't have a genuine majority rule in situations like this. Would be bad. However, there's a problem. We are not a direct democracy. We have a representative democracy functioning within a republic. Why does that matter? It means that the scare tactic being used here, genuine majority rule, this is something that only happens in direct democracies. Now, what is a direct democracy? This is where every citizen votes on policy recommendations on their own. If a policy gets put out, the citizens vote on everything. And what does get passed in the public square goes, and what doesn't get passed in the public square gets thrown out. We have what's called a representative democracy instead. What does that mean? That means that within our system, we elect officials to do this dirty work. We elect officials to become more politically inclined, to do their jobs here. This nightmare scenario that he's arguing here only comes up in direct democracies. But this nightmare scenario doesn't exist in our country because we are not a direct democracy. That is not the way our country functions. Thankfully. But unfortunately, again, this is something that seems intuitively correct. You look at this and go, yeah, no, that makes sense. Argument ad populum is a fallacy. We wouldn't want everybody just making things right or wrong based on majority rule. And you're right. It's a good thing that we don't actually do that. That's not the way our government functions. If it was, then maybe these nightmare scenarios would be worth considering. As it stands, we don't function that way. Not much of an issue. The real case, genuinely unstated, for encouraging more people to vote is a metaphysical one. The wider the turnout in elections, they make the government somehow more legitimate in a vague moral sense. But legitimacy is not popularity, and popularity is not consent. The entire notion of representative government assumes that the actual business of governing requires fewer decision-makers rather than more. So at least he understands that we have a representative government where there are fewer decision-makers. That's the exact reason why none of your arguments matter. Because we do have fewer decision-makers. That's already baked into the system. Also, thank you very much, Noetic Fox, for the follow. Representatives are people who act in other people's interests, which is distinct from carrying out a group's stated demands as certified by majority vote. Legitimacy involves, among other interests, the government's responsibility to people who are not voters, such as children, mentally incapacitated people, and non-citizen permanent residents. Their interests matter too, but we do not extend the vote to them. So now we have another issue. We have the benevolent politician, the savior politician, the bringing politicians forward so that they can do the right thing by you. Now, while what he's saying is technically true, technically, yeah, we don't extend the vote to children. We don't extend the vote to non-citizen permanent residents. However, does that suddenly mean, merely because we don't extend the vote to them, that politicians will always work in their best interest merely because it's their job? No, they won't. They won't do that. Representatives go against their constituents all the time, is one of the problems that we face right now. And that's not a contradiction with my previous statements about the benefits of having a representative democracy. Unfortunately, there are several bugs and features with all systems. None of them are perfect. I just think that he speaks out of both sides of his mouth when he says the first points about majority rule leading to chaos, and then also conceding we don't have that problem. Or at least he has to concede we don't have that problem, but he doesn't. But then he wants to use the fact that we have representative democracy as some argument that we should have fewer voters, when the representative democracy was already the solution to the argumentum ad populum problem? He just wants fewer people to vote. Now, the question you have to ask is, which people does he not want to vote? Who does he not want participating in the electoral process? And with the 2 paragraphs that have already had their little allusions to fraudulent elections, can we also assume pretty easily why he wants this? What issues he has with people voting? Georgia turned blue, and that terrifies people who write articles like this. We'll end on his final paragraph. Progressives and populists like to blame lobbyists, special interests, the swamp, insiders, the establishment, vested interests, shadowy corporate titans, and sundry boogeymen for our current straits. But the fact is that voters got us into this mess. Maybe the answer isn't more voters. So, Kevin D. Williamson, you... I don't want to make fun of your looks. I'm uglier than you. I'm not going to do that. I hide behind a cartoon for a reason. What I will say is this. That last paragraph does not follow. The mere fact that voters blame lobbyists, special interests, the swamp, etc., some voters at least, blame those things, does not suddenly mean that voters are the worst thing in the world here. Yes, in many cases, voters get us into messes, but you have to also consider how many political campaigns are built on lies and obfuscation that get voters into the headspace where they are willing to vote against their best interests. You need to take into consideration how much money gets shoved into political marketing, which effectively changes the minds of voters either quickly or over time. If you are willing to honestly engage in this conversation, the question needs to be asked, which kinds of people do you not want voting, and why? Because if you are going to engage in this conversation about who we should arbitrarily disenfranchise from voting, I need to know who, I need to know why, and I need to know where that line gets drawn. And at no point in this article did I see those arbitrary lines come. I just saw an argument for them. And once we accept that those arbitrary lines can come at all, well, if somebody else gets to decide where they're drawn, we may be digging our own graves. As always, everyone, please let me know your thoughts on the article and my deconstruction down below in the comment section or in the chat if you happen to be watching live. Please hit a like on the video if you haven't already, and follow me over on Twitch if you haven't already. That's twitch.tv/NekoSuris. Please support my channel and what I do by checking the description of the video, where you will find links to my Patreon as well as other methods of supporting the channel. And if you haven't subscribed already, please go ahead and do so on either YouTube or Twitch, though on Twitch it means money. Thank you all for watching, and as always, everyone, insert end of video tagline here.